Good evening. Tonight, we're setting out on a journey across one of the greatest landscapes in American history. Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy relaxing history stories like this one, please consider subscribing to the channel. It truly helps Whispered History continue creating long-form documentaries designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently drift off to sleep while exploring the past. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, perhaps settle beneath a warm blanket, and let your mind slowly wander westward. Imagine standing on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River on a quiet spring morning in the year 1803. The sun has only just begun to rise. A gentle mist hangs above the broad river, softening its distant shoreline into shades of pale blue and silver. The water moves steadily southward, carrying driftwood, leaves, and the occasional canoe toward the Gulf of Mexico. Birdsong echoes through forests of oak, sycamore, and cottonwood. The air smells of damp earth after a cool night. For countless generations, people have traveled these rivers. Native nations have hunted, traded, farmed, and built thriving communities across this enormous continent. French traders have paddled narrow canoes through winding waterways. Spanish settlers have established distant missions beneath the warm skies of the Southwest. A handful of American settlements have slowly expanded beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Yet for most people living along the Atlantic coast, the lands stretching west beyond the Mississippi remain largely unknown. Not entirely unknown, of course. Indigenous peoples know them intimately. They know where the buffalo roam with the changing seasons. They know the hidden springs tucked beneath sandstone cliffs. They know which rivers flood each spring and which mountain passes remain open during winter. But for many Americans living in crowded eastern towns, the West exists almost as an idea, a place of endless forests, towering mountains, rolling grasslands, and possibilities too vast to imagine. Few realize that everything is about to change. In April of 1803, representatives of the United States reach an agreement with France. President Thomas Jefferson authorizes the purchase of a vast territory stretching from the Mississippi River toward the Rocky Mountains. Known today as the Louisiana Purchase, the agreement more than doubles the size of the young United States. It is difficult to picture just how enormous this acquisition truly is. Imagine unfolding a map across a wooden table. With the stroke of a pen, millions of acres are added. Rivers no American official has ever seen. Prairies that seem to stretch forever. Snow-covered mountain ranges rising above the clouds. Dense forests filled with unfamiliar wildlife. Great plains where immense herds of buffalo move like dark waves across the horizon. The purchase costs $15 million, a remarkable sum for its time, but when measured against the sheer size of the territory, it becomes one of history's most famous land transactions. Yet owning land on paper and understanding it are two entirely different things. Maps remain incomplete. Many rivers have never been carefully surveyed. Some mountain ranges appear only as rough sketches drawn from second-hand accounts. Entire regions remain blank. To people studying those early maps, the empty spaces almost invite curiosity. What lies beyond the next river? How high are the western mountains? Does a water route connect the continent from east to west? What animals live there? Who calls these places home? Questions begin to multiply. So do dreams. For farmers, the West promises fertile soil. For merchants, it offers new trade routes. For scientists, it presents an extraordinary natural world waiting to be studied. For politicians, it represents opportunity as well as responsibility. How should such an immense land be governed? How can distant settlements remain connected to the young republic? No one yet knows the answers. Meanwhile, life continues quietly across the frontier. A family rises before sunrise inside a simple log cabin near the Ohio River. The father steps outside to split firewood while cool morning fog still clings to the fields. His boots leave fresh prints in damp grass. Nearby, chickens scratch at the earth searching for seeds. Inside the cabin, breakfast slowly cooks over a crackling fire. Cornmeal, salt pork, fresh bread, simple foods prepared with practiced hands. Children help fetch water from a nearby spring. These ordinary routines unfold every morning. Yet even here, conversations often drift westward. Neighbors speak about rich farmland beyond the Mississippi. Travelers arrive carrying stories collected from trappers and traders. Some stories are accurate, others become larger with each retelling. One traveler claims to have seen rivers wider than entire towns. Another describes endless plains where buffalo gather in numbers almost beyond belief. Someone else speaks of towering mountains whose snowy peaks shine even during summer, whether entirely true or slightly exaggerated. Such stories capture the imagination. Not everyone wishes to leave home. Many families remain content where they are. They have planted orchards, built barns, raised children, established churches and schools. Their roots reach deeply into familiar soil. But for others, the horizon begins calling. Throughout history, people have always wondered what lies beyond the edge of the map. That quiet curiosity has inspired explorers to cross oceans, sailors to follow unknown coastlines, and travelers to climb distant mountain passes. The American frontier awakens that same feeling, not simply a desire for wealth or adventure, but the timeless human wish to see what waits beyond tomorrow's sunrise. As the years pass, rivers become highways. Flatboats drift downstream carrying flour, timber, and livestock. Trading posts appear along muddy banks. Ferries transport wagons across broad crossings. Small villages slowly grow beside dependable water sources. Every settlement begins with only a handful of buildings: a blacksmith's forge, a general store, perhaps an inn where travelers share meals and exchange news late into the evening. Little by little, communities spread westward. Yet the farther one travels from the Atlantic coast, the quieter the landscape becomes. Roads narrow into rough trails. Forests grow thicker. Prairies stretch farther than the eye can see. The stars at night seem brighter. The silence becomes deeper. Standing beneath those vast skies, one cannot help but feel both very small and deeply connected to the world around them. The frontier is often remembered through dramatic moments, battles, gold discoveries, famous expeditions, legendary outlaws. But those moments tell only part of the story. Most people experience the frontier through ordinary days: repairing fences, milking cows before sunrise, mending clothing, fishing quiet streams, planting crops in hopeful spring soil, watching children chase butterflies through tall summer grass. History is built from these peaceful moments just as much as it is from extraordinary ones. Over the coming hours, we'll travel together across this changing continent. We'll paddle beside Lewis and Clark as they venture into unknown country. We'll climb into the Rocky Mountains with fur trappers and mountain men. We'll visit native nations whose histories stretch back centuries before the arrival of Europeans. We'll walk the Oregon Trail beside hopeful families searching for new beginnings. We'll experience the excitement of the California Gold Rush, the long cattle drives across the Great Plains, the construction of the great railroads, and the quiet closing of the frontier itself. But above all, we'll meet ordinary people. Because history belongs not only to presidents and generals, it belongs equally to farmers, traders, blacksmiths, school teachers, scouts, mothers, children, and every traveler who paused beside a campfire beneath an endless western sky. Our story begins with one expedition, an expedition that would forever change how Americans understood their vast new homeland. Two men would soon receive an extraordinary assignment. Their names were Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Together they would lead one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of North America. That quiet voyage is where we'll continue our journey in the next chapter. The Missouri River moved quietly beneath the first light of dawn. A thin layer of mist drifted above the water, softening the distant shoreline into gentle shades of blue and silver. Cottonwood trees leaned over the riverbanks, their leaves barely stirring in the cool morning breeze. Somewhere among the branches, a meadowlark greeted the sunrise with his cheerful song. The camp was beginning to wake. A fire crackled softly as breakfast was prepared. Tin cups were filled with coffee. Simple meals of salted pork and cornmeal were shared before another long day of travel. Nearby, several large wooden boats rested against the muddy riverbank. Their hulls were packed with supplies carefully chosen for one of the most ambitious expeditions in American history. The year was 1804. Only months had passed since the United States completed the Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson knew that owning such an enormous territory meant very little if almost nothing was known about it. The new nation needed maps. It needed scientific observations. It needed to understand the rivers, mountains, plants, animals, and the many native nations already living throughout the vast interior of North America. To accomplish that task, Jefferson turned to his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was 30 years old. He had served as an army officer and possessed a lifelong curiosity about the natural world. He enjoyed studying plants, animals, geography, and astronomy. Jefferson believed Lewis possessed exactly the qualities needed for such an extraordinary journey. But Lewis also understood that no one could complete this expedition alone. He invited William Clark to share command. Clark was an experienced frontiersman and military officer. Although Lewis technically held the higher official rank, the two men chose to lead as equals. It was a decision that would prove remarkably successful. Each respected the other's judgment. Each understood his own strengths. Their friendship became one of the expedition's greatest advantages. Together they assembled a carefully selected group of men that became known as the Corps of Discovery. Most were young soldiers. Others brought valuable skills. There were hunters who could provide food, blacksmiths capable of repairing broken tools, boatmen familiar with dangerous rivers, carpenters who could construct shelters and repair equipment, interpreters who hoped to bridge languages between very different cultures. Every person had an important role. The expedition carried an astonishing collection of supplies: guns and ammunition, axes, shovels, fishing hooks, medical instruments, blankets, cooking pots, scientific notebooks, glass beads, mirrors, and other trade goods intended as gifts for native leaders they might meet along the way. Even seeds accompanied the journey. Jefferson hoped Lewis would return with specimens that expanded scientific knowledge about the continent. On the morning of May 14, 1804, the expedition pushed away from Camp Dubois near present-day St. Louis. The boats drifted into the broad current of the Missouri River. Oars dipped quietly into the water. The adventure had begun. Traveling upstream proved far more difficult than floating downstream. The Missouri was powerful. Its muddy current resisted every stroke of the oars. In many places, the men climbed onto the riverbank, attached long ropes to the boats, and slowly pulled them forward by hand. The work demanded patience rather than speed. Every mile required determination. Yet the landscape rewarded their efforts. Each bend in the river revealed something new: towering limestone bluffs, endless prairies waving beneath the wind, dense forests where white-tailed deer moved silently among the trees, flocks of wild turkeys startled into flight, beavers building dams along quiet streams. Occasionally, enormous herds of buffalo appeared in the distance. The men paused simply to watch. Some later wrote that the ground itself seemed to move beneath the countless animals. For many members of the expedition, these sights were unlike anything they had ever imagined. Lewis carefully recorded everything. He described unfamiliar birds, measured rivers, collected plant samples, observed weather patterns. Even the smallest flower growing beside the trail might earn a place inside his notebook. Clark concentrated heavily on maps. Each evening, he carefully sketched the day's progress: rivers, hills, sandbars, villages. Every detail improved the understanding of a continent that still appeared largely blank on official maps. When night arrived, camp became a place of welcome routine. Tents were pitched, fires were built, meals were prepared, boots were dried beside glowing coals. Some men repaired clothing while others cleaned rifles or sharpened tools for tomorrow's journey. Stories drifted quietly through the camp. Laughter occasionally echoed across the river before disappearing into the evening darkness. The stars overhead seemed brighter than those visible from the crowded eastern cities. Far from town lights, the Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other. Nature itself became the expedition's constant companion. Spring slowly transformed into summer. Wildflowers covered the open prairie. Thunderstorms rolled across the plains with astonishing power. Towering clouds darkened the sky before releasing heavy rain that soaked clothing and supplies alike. Lightning illuminated distant hills. Then, almost as suddenly as they had arrived, the storms passed. The prairie returned to silence. One of the expedition's greatest strengths was its willingness to learn. Rather than assuming they already understood the land, Lewis and Clark listened carefully to those who knew it best. Throughout the journey, they met many native nations, each with its own language, traditions, and history. The Oto welcomed the expedition with formal ceremonies. Later came meetings with the Yankton Sioux, the Teton Sioux, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and many others. Some encounters were filled with friendship and generous hospitality. Others required careful diplomacy and patience. Every meeting reminded the explorers that these lands were not empty wilderness. They were home to communities whose ancestors had lived there for countless generations. Among the most important places visited during the first year was a cluster of earth lodge villages belonging to the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples in present-day North Dakota. Here, the expedition chose to spend the winter of 1804 and 1805. Travel during the coldest months would have been nearly impossible. Snow covered the plains, ice gripped the river, temperatures fell far below freezing. The Corps of Discovery built Fort Mandan, a simple wooden fort where they could safely wait for spring. Winter life followed a quieter rhythm. The men repaired equipment, mended clothing, prepared maps and journals, hunted deer and buffalo to replenish food supplies. The Mandan and Hidatsa became invaluable neighbors. Trade flourished. Knowledge was shared. The explorers learned more about the western mountains and the rivers that lay beyond. It was during this winter that two new members joined the expedition: a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Sacagawea was only a teenager and carried with her an infant son named Jean-Baptiste. Although history often remembers her simply as a guide, her contributions reached far beyond that single role. She served as an interpreter. She recognized landmarks remembered from her childhood. She helped identify edible plants. Her calm presence traveling with a baby also signaled peaceful intentions to many native communities. Groups encountering the expedition often understood that a war party would not likely include a young mother carrying an infant. Sometimes the smallest details carry the greatest importance. As spring finally returned, the frozen Missouri slowly awakened. Ice drifted downstream. Birdsong returned to the cottonwood trees. fresh green shoots emerged across the prairie. The core of discovery loaded its boats once again. Ahead lay the Great Plains, then the Rocky Mountains. Beyond them, the Pacific Ocean. The hardest part of the journey had not yet begun. The maps grew emptier with every mile west. The rivers became swifter, the mountains taller. Yet curiosity remained stronger than uncertainty. Each sunrise invited another day of discovery. Each bend in the river promised another view. No American expedition had carefully recorded before. In our next chapter, we'll leave the broad Missouri behind and follow the mountain men and fur traders who would transform the Rocky Mountains into their home, living among snow-covered peaks, rushing rivers, and forests, where survival depended upon patience, skill, and an intimate understanding of nature. Morning arrived quietly in the Rocky Mountains. The first rays of sunlight slipped through towering pine trees, casting long golden beams across the forest floor. Cool air drifted down from the snow-covered peaks. A narrow stream tumbled over smooth stones, its clear water reflecting patches of bright blue sky between the branches. Somewhere high above, an eagle circled effortlessly on rising currents of air. The wilderness seemed endless. There were no church bells, no busy streets, no villages waiting beyond the next hill, only forests, mountains, rivers, and silence. It was here that a different kind of frontier life began to take shape, not among large groups of settlers or organized expeditions, but through small bands of men who ventured into the wilderness searching for one of the most valuable natural resources of the early 19th century, beaver fur. Today it may seem surprising that an animal as quiet as the beaver could help shape the history of the American West. But during the early 1800s, beaver pelts were in enormous demand throughout Europe and the eastern United States. Their thick, waterproof fur could be turned into high-quality felt used to make fashionable hats. A well-made beaver hat became a symbol of style and success. As demand grew, so did opportunity. Trappers began pushing farther into the mountains than almost anyone before them. These men would eventually become known as the mountain men. Unlike soldiers or explorers, mountain men usually traveled in very small groups. Sometimes only 2 or 3 companions shared the journey. Occasionally, a trapper worked entirely alone for weeks at a time. They carried only what they truly needed: rifles, powder horns, steel traps, blankets, cooking pots, a few simple tools. Every additional pound became harder to carry through steep mountain passes or across rushing rivers. Their lives followed the rhythm of nature. Before sunrise, many checked the lines of steel traps they had carefully placed beside quiet streams the evening before. Beavers preferred calm stretches of water where they built dams from branches and mud. Finding these places required patience and close observation. Freshly cut saplings, mud packed against fallen trees, rippled water beside a quiet pond. The smallest details often revealed where beavers had been working. The work itself demanded long hours. Trappers carefully prepared the pelts before hanging them to dry. Each valuable hide represented weeks of difficult travel. Every pelt would eventually be carried hundreds of miles to trading posts where merchants exchanged goods from around the world. Yet trapping occupied only part of daily life. The mountains constantly demanded attention. Weather changed without warning. A clear summer morning could become an afternoon thunderstorm. Snow sometimes arrived early in autumn. Fast-moving rivers swelled after heavy rain, making familiar crossings suddenly dangerous. The wilderness rewarded those who remained patient. It punished those who grew careless. Perhaps no mountain man became more famous than Jedediah Smith. Born in New York, Smith possessed remarkable determination and an endless curiosity about the unknown West. Unlike many trappers, he also carried a Bible wherever he traveled. His journals described difficult crossings through deserts, mountains, and forests that few Americans had ever seen. Smith became one of the first non-indigenous Americans to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains and explore large portions of present-day California, Utah, and Oregon. His journeys filled countless blank spaces on American maps. Another legendary frontiersman was Jim Bridger. Bridger entered the fur trade while still a teenager. Over the following decades, he gained extraordinary knowledge of the Rocky Mountains. He learned countless trails, hidden valleys, and dependable water sources. Many later travelers relied upon routes first explored by Bridger and other experienced mountain men. Bridger also became known for his colorful storytelling. Friends sometimes joked that it was difficult to know where his true adventures ended and his imagination began. Whether describing boiling rivers or forests filled with strange sights, his stories became part of frontier folklore. Yet even the greatest mountain men rarely survived by relying only upon themselves. Again and again they depended upon the knowledge of native peoples who had lived among these mountains for generations. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Flathead, the Nez Perce, the Blackfeet. Many different nations possessed deep understanding of the landscape. They knew which valleys remained passable after heavy snow, which berries could safely be eaten, where buffalo gathered during different seasons, how to cross dangerous rivers, how to survive harsh winters. Some native communities welcomed trade with mountain men. Beaver pelts could be exchanged for metal tools, cloth, firearms, horses, and other useful goods. Friendships sometimes developed. Some mountain men married native women, creating families that connected two very different worlds. Children growing up in these households often spoke multiple languages and moved comfortably between cultures. Like every relationship throughout history, these interactions varied greatly. Some brought cooperation, others brought misunderstanding. Every community made its own choices according to its own experiences. One of the most anticipated events each year was the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. Beginning in the 1820s, trappers gathered each summer at carefully chosen locations throughout the mountains. For weeks, the quiet wilderness suddenly filled with activity. Hundreds of horses grazed across open meadows. Tents appeared beside rivers. Merchants arrived with wagons loaded with supplies, fresh powder, lead, blankets, coffee, sugar, cooking utensils, clothing, books, musical instruments. Everything a trapper might need after months in the wilderness. The rendezvous served as far more than a marketplace. Old friends reunited after long winters, spent hundreds of miles apart. Stories were exchanged beside evening campfires. Maps were compared. Rumors of new rivers or unexplored valleys spread quickly from one group to another. Fiddles played cheerful tunes late into the night. Laughter echoed across mountain valleys. For many mountain men, these gatherings became the social highlight of the entire year. Then, almost as quickly as they had assembled, everyone departed. The camps disappeared. The valleys returned to silence. Only fading campfire ashes remained. The mountains reclaimed their quiet. Life between rendezvous remained wonderfully simple. Morning often began beside a clear stream where frost covered the grass. Breakfast might consist of venison, trout, or freshly baked bread cooked in a cast iron skillet. Horses grazed peacefully nearby. After packing camp, the day's journey continued through forests scented with pine and cedar. Wildlife appeared around nearly every bend. Elk grazed in mountain meadows. Bighorn sheep climbed impossible cliffs. black bears searched for berries beneath thick bushes. Occasionally, a grizzly bear wandered across a distant hillside, reminding travelers that they shared these mountains with creatures perfectly adapted to wilderness life. The changing seasons shaped every decision. Spring brought swollen rivers fed by melting snow. Summer opened high mountain passes. Autumn painted aspen groves brilliant shades of gold. Winter transformed entire landscapes beneath deep snow, making travel extraordinarily difficult. Successful mountain men learned to observe every sign nature offered: the direction of the wind, the shape of gathering clouds, fresh animal tracks, the sound of distant rivers. The mountains quietly rewarded careful attention. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, however, the great era of the mountain men slowly began to fade. Fashion changed in Europe. Silk hats became more popular than beaver felt. Demand for pelts declined. The once profitable fur trade gradually lost its importance. Many mountain men adapted once again. Some became guides for wagon trains heading west. Others worked as scouts for military expeditions. Several established trading posts that later grew into frontier towns. The knowledge they had gathered did not disappear. It simply found new purpose. Perhaps without realizing it, these quiet trappers had accomplished something far greater than collecting beaver pelts. They had explored rivers, crossed mountain passes, mapped valleys, recorded trails. Future emigrants traveling west would often follow routes first discovered by these patient wilderness travelers. The frontier itself was changing. The age of solitary trappers slowly gave way to something much larger: families, wagons, entire communities preparing to move west. But before thousands of settlers crossed the plains, we must first meet the people who had called those vast grasslands home for countless generations. In our next chapter, we'll leave the high mountains behind and journey onto the Great Plains, where powerful native nations built rich cultures centered around horses, buffalo, family, and traditions that stretched back long before the frontier reached their horizon. The sun rose slowly over the Great Plains. Golden light spread across an ocean of tall grass that seemed to stretch forever. The prairie rolled gently toward distant horizons, where earth and sky blended into soft shades of blue. A cool breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass still covered with morning dew. Somewhere nearby, meadowlarks filled the quiet air with cheerful songs. Far in the distance, dark shapes moved slowly across the open land. At first glance, they looked like drifting clouds, but as the light grew stronger, their forms became clearer. They were buffalo, hundreds of them, then thousands. Some grazed peacefully, others wandered in long lines across the prairie. Calves remained close beside their mothers. Dust rose gently beneath countless hooves. The sight was unlike anything many visitors from the eastern United States had ever imagined. For thousands of years, the Great Plains had supported one of the richest ecosystems in North America. The grasslands fed immense buffalo herds. The rivers nourished forests along their banks. Prairie dogs built sprawling underground towns. Antelope raced across the open country with astonishing speed. Wolves followed the migrations. Eagles soared high overhead. This remarkable landscape was far from empty. Long before explorers, trappers, or wagon trains entered the plains, many native nations had built thriving communities here. Each possessed its own language, its own traditions, its own history. Together they created one of the most diverse cultural landscapes on the continent. Among the best known were the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Blackfeet, Pawnee, Kiowa, Comanche, and many others. Although they are sometimes grouped together in history books under the simple phrase Plains Indians, Each nation maintained its own identity and way of life. Some communities lived farther north near the Missouri River, others occupied the Central Plains. Still others ranged across the southern grasslands, reaching into present-day Texas, Oklahoma, and eastern New Mexico. The land itself shaped daily life. One of the greatest transformations came with the arrival of the horse. Spanish explorers first introduced horses into North America during the 16th century. Over time, escaped animals spread northward across the continent. Native communities gradually acquired horses through trade, exchange, and careful breeding. By the 18th century, many Plains nations had become extraordinary horsemen. The horse changed nearly every aspect of life. Travel became faster. Buffalo hunts became more efficient. Families could move larger camps with greater ease. Trade expanded across enormous distances. Children often learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Watching skilled riders cross the prairie must have seemed almost effortless. Horse and rider moved together with remarkable harmony. Yet despite the importance of horses, the buffalo remained at the very heart of life across much of the Great Plains. The buffalo provided food throughout the year. Its hide became warm robes during harsh winters. Strong leather was used for clothing, shields, ropes, and moccasins. Bones became tools. Sinew became thread. Horns found new purpose as cups and utensils. Very little was wasted. Respect for the animal formed an important part of many traditions. Buffalo hunting required remarkable cooperation. Rather than acting alone, hunters often worked together with careful planning. Experienced riders quietly guided the herd into favorable positions before beginning the chase. Success depended not only upon courage, but upon patience, skill, and teamwork. After the hunt, entire families participated in preparing meat and hides. Children helped according to their age. Elders shared knowledge gathered across many generations. Every person contributed. The home itself reflected the rhythm of life upon the plains. Many families lived in teepees, constructed from long wooden poles covered with buffalo hides. A teepee could be assembled or taken down surprisingly quickly. This flexibility proved invaluable. As buffalo herds moved with the seasons, families could move with them. Inside, the space felt warm and welcoming. Soft robes covered the ground. Cooking fires burned safely in the center beneath an opening that allowed smoke to escape. Personal belongings were carefully arranged along the walls. Although simple in appearance, every detail served a practical purpose. Morning often began before sunrise. Women prepared breakfast while the camp slowly awakened. Children gathered firewood or fetched water from nearby streams. Men checked horses grazing beyond the edge of camp. Dogs wandered happily among the teepees. The smell of fresh cooking drifted gently into the cool morning air, like families everywhere. Life consisted mostly of ordinary moments, meals shared together, children learning from parents, neighbors visiting one another, grandparents telling stories beneath evening skies. Education happened naturally throughout daily life. Young boys learned to care for horses, hunt, and understand the changing seasons. Girls learned skills that helped sustain both family and community, including preparing food, tanning hides, sewing clothing, and creating beautifully decorated household items. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation, practice, and patient instruction. Stories held special importance. Long before history was written in books, it lived within memory. Elders shared accounts of earlier generations, teaching not only what had happened, but why it mattered. Some stories explained the origins of particular traditions. Others described lessons about generosity, bravery, humility, or respect. Children listened carefully, In time, they would pass those same stories to future generations. Spiritual life also remained deeply connected to nature, the rising sun, the changing seasons, the return of migrating animals, the movement of stars across the night sky, all reminded people of their place within a much larger world. Although beliefs differed from one nation to another, many traditions emphasized gratitude, balance, and respect for the natural world that sustained life. Trade connected the plains with distant regions. Long before American settlers arrived in large numbers, goods traveled across extensive networks linking many native nations. Buffalo robes, pipes carved from red stone, horses, copper, shells from distant oceans, brightly colored cloth obtained through European traders, metal tools. Every exchange carried not only goods but ideas and friendships as well. Visitors arriving from other communities were often welcomed with generosity. Hospitality held deep importance. Sharing food, offering shelter, and treating guests with respect strengthened relationships across the plains. Like every society, disagreements sometimes occurred. Competition over hunting grounds, horses, or other resources could create conflict. But peaceful trade, alliances, marriages, and diplomacy occupied just as much of everyday life. The plains were home to vibrant living communities, not simply battlefields. As the 19th century progressed, however, new visitors appeared more frequently. At first came explorers, then fur traders. Soon afterward arrived missionaries, military expeditions, surveyors, and wagon trains carrying families westward. Each year, more trails crossed the prairie, more trading posts appeared beside rivers, more unfamiliar faces entered landscapes that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Many native leaders welcomed opportunities for trade. Others watched these changes with growing concern. No one could yet fully imagine how dramatically the frontier itself would soon transform. For now, the grass still swayed beneath the wind. Buffalo continued their ancient migrations. Children raced beside streams, while elders watched quietly beneath endless skies. The Great Plains remained a place of extraordinary beauty, where human life moved in harmony with the changing seasons. Yet beyond the eastern horizon, thousands of settlers were preparing their wagons. New roads were being surveyed, new forts were being planned. The frontier was becoming busier with every passing year. Those forts, isolated outposts standing between distant settlements and the open frontier, would soon become important gathering places for soldiers, traders, travelers, and families alike. That is where our journey will continue in the next chapter, as we step inside the daily life of the frontier forts that quietly shaped the expanding American West. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the frontier fort. Morning arrived quietly. A thin layer of mist rested over the nearby river, while the wooden walls of the fort slowly glowed with warm shades of amber beneath the rising sun. The night watch ended its shift. A bugle sounded across the parade ground. Stable doors creaked open as horses greeted the new day with soft snorts and gentle stomps. Smoke curled upward from stone chimneys. Another ordinary day on the American frontier had begun. When many people imagine frontier forts, they often picture constant danger and dramatic battles. Popular stories sometimes suggest that life inside these outposts consisted almost entirely of conflict. The reality was usually much quieter. Most days passed without a single shot being fired. Instead, frontier forts functioned as small communities. They served as supply depots, post offices, workshops, hospitals, trading centers, and temporary homes for hundreds of people living far from America's larger towns and cities. During the early and middle years of the 19th century, Dozens of military forts appeared across the expanding frontier. Some stood beside important rivers, others overlooked mountain passes, or protected busy wagon trails. Many were built near growing settlements where travelers frequently stopped to rest before continuing westward. Places like Fort Laramie, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Union, and Fort Kearny became familiar names to emigrants traveling toward Oregon, California, and the Southwest. Although each fort looked slightly different, many shared similar layouts. Tall wooden palisades surrounded the grounds. Inside stood rows of simple barracks where soldiers slept. Nearby were officers' quarters, stables, storehouses, kitchens, workshops, and blacksmith shops. Most forts also included a hospital, a small chapel, and a parade ground where daily drills took place. Some larger forts even supported schools for military families. Life followed a predictable rhythm. Long before sunrise, soldiers awoke to the sound of the bugle. Blankets were folded, beds were neatly arranged, uniforms carefully brushed. Within minutes, the parade ground filled with orderly lines of men preparing for morning inspection. Officers walked slowly past each row. Boots were expected to shine. Equipment had to remain clean. Even small details mattered. Discipline formed the foundation of military life. Once inspections ended, breakfast became everyone's favorite part of the morning. Meals were simple but filling. Fresh bread when available, salt pork or bacon, beans, coffee, occasionally eggs or vegetables from the fort's own gardens. Some soldiers joked that beans appeared on the menu almost every day. Still, after long hours of work outdoors, even modest meals were deeply appreciated. Much of the day's work had little to do with military training. Soldiers repaired fences damaged by storms. They chopped firewood for kitchens and barracks. They cared for horses, cleaned stables, hauled water from nearby rivers, and helped construct new buildings whenever the fort expanded. Every skill proved valuable. Carpenters repaired roofs, masons built chimneys, wheelwrights fixed broken wagon wheels. The frontier demanded practical knowledge more often than military heroics. One of the busiest places inside nearly every fort was the blacksmith's shop. From early morning until sunset, the steady ring of hammer against glowing iron echoed through the grounds. Horseshoes wore out quickly on rocky trails. Wagon parts constantly needed repair. Axes became dull after weeks of chopping wood. The blacksmith kept everything moving. His forge glowed bright orange beneath clouds of rising sparks. Nearby, apprentices worked the heavy bellows, while finished tools cooled upon wooden benches. Without skilled blacksmiths, life on the frontier would have slowed almost to a halt. The stable was equally important. Horses represented the fort's greatest source of mobility. Cavalry patrols depended entirely upon healthy animals. Every morning, stable hands brushed coats, inspected hooves, and filled feed troughs with grain and hay. Veterinary medicine remained limited by modern standards, so careful daily attention often prevented more serious problems later. Some soldiers developed close bonds with the horses they rode. Long journeys across lonely landscapes naturally encouraged quiet companionship. Doctors also worked under challenging conditions. Military hospitals inside frontier forts were small but essential. Most patients suffered not from battle injuries, but from ordinary illnesses. Influenza, pneumonia, broken bones after falls from horses, infected cuts, heat exhaustion during long summer patrols. Medical knowledge continued improving throughout the 19th century, but many treatments remained basic. Doctors relied heavily upon rest, clean bandages, careful observation, and whatever medicines were available. Nurses, often assisted by soldiers or family members, provided constant care. The hospital reminded everyone that everyday life carried risks even during peaceful times. One of the happiest moments at any frontier fort arrived whenever the mail wagon appeared. News traveled slowly across the expanding nation. Letters sometimes took weeks or even months to reach distant outposts. As soon as word spread that fresh mail had arrived, excitement filled the fort. Soldiers eagerly searched for envelopes bearing familiar handwriting. Some received joyful news of births or weddings. Others learned about harvests back home, new businesses opening in distant towns, or younger brothers beginning school. A simple letter could brighten an entire month. Families also lived within many frontier forts. Officers often brought wives and children west with them. Their presence transformed what might otherwise have been isolated military posts into genuine communities. Children attended small schools whenever teachers were available. They played games across the parade ground after lessons ended. Laughter echoed between the buildings while mothers tended gardens or gathered for afternoon sewing circles. Birthdays, holiday celebrations, church services, and community dinners helped create a sense of normal life far from larger settlements. Outside the gates, civilian merchants frequently established trading posts. Travelers stopped to purchase flour, coffee, blankets, tools, ammunition, or fresh livestock before continuing their journeys westward. Blacksmiths repaired wagon wheels. Carpenters fixed broken axles. Hotels and inns gradually appeared nearby. Many frontier towns began as little more than businesses serving the needs of passing wagon trains and military forts. Not every visitor wore a military uniform. Native leaders often visited frontier forts to meet with government officials. Some discussions focused upon trade, others concerned travel routes, hunting grounds, or agreements intended to maintain peaceful relations. Interpreters carefully translated conversations between different languages and cultures. These meetings required patience, diplomacy, and mutual respect. Although misunderstandings sometimes occurred, many peaceful discussions took place inside these very walls. Meanwhile, wagon trains continued arriving throughout the warmer months. Dozens of covered wagons rolled slowly through the gates seeking rest after difficult weeks upon dusty trails. Oxen grazed beside nearby streams. Children stretched their legs after long days spent riding. Campfires filled the evening with the comforting smell of fresh bread, coffee, and stew. Experienced soldiers often shared practical advice with immigrants preparing to continue west. Which river crossings remained safe? Where could dependable water be found? How far until the next trading post? Such conversations became part of everyday frontier life. As evening approached, activity gradually slowed. The blacksmith's forge cooled. Horses settled quietly inside the stables. Dinner was served. Perhaps beef stew, fresh bread, beans once again. Afterward, soldiers gathered outside the barracks. Some played cards beneath lantern light. Others quietly wrote letters home. A fiddle occasionally filled the cool evening air with familiar melodies. Stories were exchanged about distant hometowns, difficult journeys, or unusual wildlife spotted during recent patrols. Above them, countless stars slowly appeared across the vast western sky. Far from the crowded cities of the east, the night seemed wonderfully clear. The Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other. Coyotes called softly somewhere beyond the fort walls. The frontier grew still once again. Most days ended exactly as they had begun, not with excitement, but with routine. And perhaps that routine offered something even more valuable: stability. In a land changing rapidly with every passing year, frontier forts became places where travelers could rest, families could build communities, and soldiers could find a measure of familiarity beneath the endless skies of the American West. As the nation continued expanding, however, these forts would soon witness something remarkable: long lines of covered wagons heading southwest toward one of America's oldest trade routes, the Santa Fe Trail. That is where our journey will continue in the next chapter. The morning air was cool as the first wagons rolled slowly onto the open prairie. Wooden wheels creaked with every turn. Leather harnesses jingled softly as teams of oxen leaned into their heavy loads. The rising sun painted the endless grasslands with warm shades of gold, while long shadows stretched behind the travelers, making their steady journey toward the southwest. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of open country. Behind them were the familiar towns of Missouri. Between the two stretched one of the most important roads in the history of the American frontier, the Santa Fe Trail. Unlike the Oregon Trail, where many families hoped to build new homes, the Santa Fe Trail began primarily as a road for commerce. It connected the growing American settlements along the Missouri River with Santa Fe, one of the oldest communities in the Southwest. For centuries before the United States expanded westward, Santa Fe had been an important center of trade under Spanish and later Mexican rule. Its adobe buildings stood beneath brilliant blue skies, surrounded by mountains and high desert landscapes, unlike anything found farther east. Merchants recognized an opportunity. If goods could be carried safely across the plains, both sides might benefit. American manufactured products could be exchanged for silver, woven blankets, mules, livestock, and goods arriving from Mexico. In 1821, shortly after Mexico gained its independence from Spain, trade between the two regions expanded rapidly. What began as a challenging journey soon became one of North America's busiest commercial roads. Each spring, wagon caravans gathered in western Missouri. Merchants spent weeks preparing for departure. Every item had to be carefully selected: bolts of cloth, iron tools, cooking utensils, glassware, books, buttons, needles, coffee, sugar, tea, even small luxury items that were difficult to obtain in distant settlements. Every wagon represented months of planning. Before leaving, experienced teamsters inspected every wheel. Axles were greased, harnesses repaired, barrels filled with drinking water, flour, beans, salt pork, and dried fruit were packed into wooden crates. Extra wagon tongues, spare wheels, ropes, and tools were secured beneath heavy canvas covers. A single broken axle hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement could delay an entire caravan. Preparation meant survival. Unlike many modern roads, the Santa Fe Trail was not a single clearly marked path. Instead, it consisted of several routes that gradually developed over time. Travelers chose their direction according to weather, available water, and changing conditions across the plains. Two of the best-known routes became the mountain route, which followed rivers and passed near the Rocky Mountains, and the Cimarron route, a shorter but riskier path crossing long stretches of open prairie and semi-arid country. Choosing between them required careful judgment. Water often determined every decision. Each morning began long before sunrise. Campfires flickered to life beneath dark skies still filled with stars. Coffee simmered in black iron pots, biscuits baked beside glowing coals. Oxen were gathered from nearby grazing areas and patiently harnessed to the wagons. Children, if traveling with merchant families, rubbed sleep from their eyes while blankets were folded and packed away. By first light, the caravan was already moving. The pace remained steady rather than fast. Oxen walked slowly but possessed remarkable strength. Most caravans covered between 15 and 20 miles during a good day's travel. There was little reason to hurry. Pushing the animals too hard could exhaust them long before reaching Santa Fe. The prairie itself constantly changed. Some days travelers crossed rolling grasslands filled with wildflowers dancing in the breeze. Other days the landscape became flatter, stretching toward horizons that seemed almost impossibly distant. Creeks wound quietly through the tall grass. Cottonwood groves offered welcome shade during warm afternoons. Occasionally, vast buffalo herds appeared in the distance, moving peacefully across the plains just as they had for countless generations. Wildlife surrounded the trail. Pronghorn antelope sprinted across open country with astonishing speed. Prairie dogs barked from their underground towns before disappearing into their burrows. Hawks circled overhead, searching for movement below. At night, coyotes called beneath skies crowded with stars. For many travelers, the journey offered their first opportunity to experience the extraordinary beauty of the Great Plains. Not every day proved easy. Summer thunderstorms could appear with astonishing speed. Dark clouds gathered along the horizon before sweeping across the prairie with powerful winds. Rain turned dry ground into deep mud that trapped wagon wheels. Lightning flashed across the open sky. The caravan halted until conditions improved. Nature always set the pace. Water remained the greatest concern, especially along the Cimarron route. Some stretches offered very few dependable streams. Experienced guides knew where hidden springs could usually be found, but drought sometimes changed familiar patterns. Travelers learned never to waste fresh water. Every barrel mattered. Every river crossing brought relief. The Arkansas River became one of the trail's most important landmarks. Its broad valley offered water, grazing, and an opportunity to rest, both people and animals. Camp beside the river often felt almost peaceful after days of dry prairie travel. Clothing could finally be washed, wagons repaired, animals allowed to graze on fresh grass, while merchants prepared supper beneath the evening sky. The Santa Fe Trail also became a meeting place between many different cultures. American merchants frequently traded with Mexican business owners. Native nations, including the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others, lived throughout regions crossed by the trail. Some groups developed important trading relationships with caravans. Horses, buffalo robes, food, and local knowledge could all become part of these exchanges. Like many frontier interactions, relationships varied over time and from place to place. Diplomacy, mutual respect, and experienced interpreters often played essential roles in maintaining successful trade. One of the busiest stops along the trail was Bent's Fort. Constructed in present-day southeastern Colorado during the 1830s, the fort stood beside the Arkansas River as an important trading center. Its thick adobe walls enclosed storerooms, workshops, kitchens, sleeping quarters, and a busy courtyard where many languages could be heard on any given day. American traders, Mexican merchants, Cheyenne families, mountain men, military officers, travelers heading in every direction, all found reason to stop there. The fort became far more than a place to exchange goods. It became a place where news traveled, stories spread quickly. Travelers learned about changing weather, river conditions, new settlements, and safe routes farther west. A caravan arriving after weeks on the trail often paused several days before continuing. The chance to rest beneath solid walls and enjoy fresh meals was greatly appreciated. As the wagons moved farther southwest, the landscape slowly transformed. The endless green grasslands gradually gave way to shorter prairie grasses. Cottonwood forests became less common. Dry mesas rose in the distance. The air itself felt different, warmer during the day, cooler after sunset. The Rocky Mountains appeared along the western horizon, their snow-covered peaks shining brilliantly beneath the afternoon sun. For many travelers, this first glimpse of the mountains remained unforgettable. Eventually, after weeks of steady travel, the caravan descended toward Santa Fe. Adobe homes reflected warm earth tones beneath the bright New Mexico sky. Church bells echoed gently across narrow streets. Markets filled with merchants selling woven blankets, pottery, leather goods, spices, silverwork, and fresh produce. Spanish, English, and numerous native languages blended together in lively conversation. After so many quiet days upon the prairie, the bustling town felt wonderfully alive. The Santa Fe Trail became much more than a commercial road. It connected distant communities, encouraged cultural exchange, supported growing frontier settlements, and demonstrated that the expanding West would be shaped not only by exploration, but also by trade, cooperation, and the countless ordinary people who carried goods across the continent one careful mile at a time. Yet even as merchants continued traveling southwest, another trail farther north was capturing the imagination of thousands of families. Unlike the Santa Fe Trail, they were not carrying goods to market. They were carrying their entire lives toward a new beginning. In our next chapter, we'll join the long wagon trains of the Oregon Trail, where parents, children, and hopeful immigrants crossed rivers, climbed mountain passes, and journeyed together toward the distant Pacific Northwest. The first hint of dawn appeared as a pale ribbon of light above the prairie. Camp was still quiet. Only the soft crackling of a dying fire and the occasional low call of an ox broke the silence. One by one, families emerged from their canvas tents or climbed down from their covered wagons. Blankets were folded. Coffee simmered over fresh flames. Children rubbed sleepy eyes as the smell of baking biscuits drifted through the cool morning air. Another day on the Oregon Trail was about to begin. For thousands of immigrants during the 1840s and 1850s, this quiet routine became part of everyday life. Unlike the merchants traveling the Santa Fe Trail, these travelers carried nearly everything they owned. They were not simply making a journey. They were moving their homes. Many hoped never to return. The Oregon Trail stretched for more than 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri, to the fertile valleys of the Pacific Northwest. It crossed rivers, climbed mountain passes, and wound through grasslands, deserts, and forests, unlike any landscapes most immigrants had ever seen. The journey often lasted 4 to 6 months. Success depended less upon speed than upon patience, careful planning, and cooperation. Preparations usually began long before departure. Families spent months deciding what to bring. Every wagon had limited space. Heavy furniture remained behind. Only the most essential belongings could make the journey. Clothing, cooking pots, blankets, farming tools, seeds, family Bibles, a few treasured photographs or keepsakes. Some children packed a favorite doll or a handmade toy carved from wood. These small reminders of home often became precious comforts during long evenings on the trail. Many travelers imagined that horses would pull their wagons west. Instead, most relied upon oxen. Although slower, oxen proved remarkably dependable. They required less expensive feed, tolerated difficult conditions, and possessed the strength needed to pull heavy wagons across rough country. A typical wagon traveled only 2 miles per hour. There was rarely any reason to rush. Each sunrise brought another 15 or 20 miles closer to Oregon. The trail itself quickly settled into a familiar rhythm. Before dawn, camp stirred to life. Breakfast might include bacon, biscuits, cornmeal, or beans, accompanied by strong coffee for the adults. After eating, tents were packed, animals harnessed, and wagons carefully loaded. Every item had its place. A loose barrel or shifting crate could upset the balance of the wagon during rough travel. Soon the long line began moving once again. From a distance, the caravan resembled a slow-moving ribbon stretching across the prairie. Dust rose gently beneath hundreds of wooden wheels. The steady creaking of wagon axles became one of the trail's most familiar sounds. Many travelers later wrote that they could still remember that gentle rhythm years after reaching their destination. Most of the day was spent walking. Although the wagons were built to carry supplies, there was rarely enough room for everyone to ride comfortably. Adults often walked beside the oxen. Older children did the same. Only very young children, elderly travelers, or those who were ill usually remained inside the wagons for long periods. Walking mile after mile became part of daily life. Yet the landscape constantly rewarded those willing to look around. The Great Plains stretched endlessly beneath enormous skies. Wildflowers covered the prairie during spring. Herds of buffalo still wandered across portions of the grasslands. Antelope darted gracefully across open country. Occasionally, wolves appeared far in the distance before disappearing once again beyond rolling hills. Every evening brought another carefully organized camp. Rather than arranging wagons in perfect circles, as many movies suggest, immigrants often park them in practical lines or loose groupings, depending upon the landscape and available water. Nearby streams became valuable gathering places. Clothing was washed. Animals drank deeply after the day's march. Children splashed happily along shallow banks while parents prepared supper. After sunset, campfires flickered across the prairie like scattered stars. Conversations drifted softly through the evening air. Neighbors exchanged stories. Someone played a fiddle. Others sang familiar hymns remembered from churches hundreds of miles behind them. Even after difficult days, these simple moments helped lift everyone's spirits. Children found ways to make the long journey an adventure. They collected unusual rocks, pressed wildflowers between the pages of books, counted buffalo along the horizon, raced beside the wagons whenever the trail became smooth enough. Parents encouraged lessons whenever possible. Reading, writing, and arithmetic continued around campfires or during rest days. Education did not stop simply because the classroom had disappeared. Of course, life on the trail also required constant work. Meals had to be cooked, water gathered, wagons repaired, harnesses inspected, animals cared for each morning and evening. Women often spent long hours baking bread, mending clothing, washing laundry, and caring for children while also helping manage countless other daily responsibilities. Men frequently repaired equipment, hunted when opportunities arose, and watched over livestock. Yet many tasks were shared by the entire family. Everyone contributed according to age and ability. One of the greatest challenges involved crossing rivers. Bridges were rare. Many streams could be crossed safely by driving the wagons through shallow water. Larger rivers demanded careful preparation. Sometimes immigrants waited several days for water levels to fall. At other crossings, ferries carried wagons from one bank to the other. Every crossing required patience. A single mistake could damage supplies or separate families from valuable livestock. These moments reminded travelers that nature, not the clock, determined their progress. As the weeks passed, familiar landmarks became important milestones. Chimney Rock rose dramatically above the Nebraska prairie, its tall stone spire visible for miles across the open grasslands. Scotts Bluff soon followed, its towering cliffs guiding travelers toward the Platte River. Many immigrants paused simply to admire these remarkable formations. Some carved their names into nearby rocks, leaving quiet traces of their journey for those who followed. The trail also passed through lands that had long been home to many native nations, including the Pawnee, Lakota, Shoshone, Cayuse, Nez Perce, and others. Experiences varied from place to place. Many immigrants traded peacefully for fresh food, horses, or local knowledge. Native guides sometimes offered valuable advice about weather, river crossings, or mountain routes. These encounters reminded travelers that the West was already a homeland to many thriving communities long before wagon trains arrived. By midsummer, the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains finally appeared along the western horizon. For weeks, they had seemed almost unchanged, always distant despite each day's progress. Gradually, however, they grew larger. Snow-covered summits reflected brilliant sunlight above dark forests and winding rivers. Many travelers described their first close view of the mountains as unforgettable. Crossing South Pass in present-day Wyoming proved to be one of the journey's great turning points. Unlike many steep mountain passes, South Pass offered a broad, gently rising road through the Rockies. The climb demanded effort, but it allowed thousands of wagons to cross a mountain range that had once seemed almost impossible to traverse. Standing there, many immigrants realized they had reached the western side of the Continental Divide. From this point onward, rivers no longer flowed toward the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, they began their long journey toward the Pacific. Beyond the mountains, the landscape changed once again. The air became drier. Sagebrush covered wide valleys. Pine forests returned along higher elevations. Eventually, the trail entered the lush valleys of the Pacific Northwest, where rivers, fertile soil, and towering evergreen forests offered the promise of permanent homes. For families who had spent months upon dusty trails, the sight of green fields and abundant water brought enormous relief. The Oregon Trail became far more than a road across the continent. It carried hopes, dreams, hard work, patience, and countless ordinary families searching for opportunity in an unfamiliar land. Their wagons helped shape the future of the American West, one slow mile at a time. Yet while many settlers continued northwest toward Oregon, another destination farther south suddenly captured the world's attention. Rumors spread of shining metal hidden in California's rivers. Within only a few years, those whispers would become one of the greatest migrations in American history. That remarkable story is where our journey continues next as we explore the excitement, hardships, and everyday life of the California Gold Rush. The morning fog drifted gently above the American River. Its calm waters reflected the pale colors of dawn, while tall oak trees cast long shadows across the quiet banks. Birds called from the branches overhead. The air carried the scent of damp earth mixed with the fresh fragrance of pine drifting down from the nearby Sierra Nevada mountains. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary California morning, a peaceful place where the river flowed exactly as it had for thousands of years. Yet beneath its shallow waters rested something that would soon capture the attention of the entire world: tiny flakes of gold. On January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James W. Marshall was inspecting work at a sawmill being built for John Sutter near Coloma, California. As water rushed through the mill race, something bright caught his eye. He bent down and picked up several small yellow pieces from the riverbed. After careful testing, Marshall and Sutter slowly realized what they had found. It was gold. At first, they hoped to keep the discovery quiet. The sawmill remained unfinished, and Sutter worried that news of gold would draw workers away from farming and construction. For several weeks, only a handful of people knew the secret, but remarkable discoveries rarely remain hidden for long. Rumors spread from one settlement to another. Travelers carried the story eastward. Newspapers printed exciting reports. By the end of 1848, news had reached cities across the United States, Latin America, Europe, Australia, and Asia. Almost overnight, California became the destination for one of history's greatest migrations. Those who arrived during 1849 soon became known by a memorable nickname, the 49ers. Some traveled overland across the Oregon and California trails. Others sailed around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a voyage that often lasted many months. Still others crossed the Isthmus of Panama before boarding another ship bound for San Francisco. Every route demanded patience and determination. The promise of opportunity inspired people from remarkably different backgrounds. Farmers left familiar fields. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Blacksmiths, teachers, sailors, carpenters, doctors, musicians, and laborers all joined the growing movement westward. Some came alone, others traveled with friends or relatives. A few entire families packed their belongings and set out together. Many hoped to become wealthy. Most simply hoped for a better future. When the first arrivals reached California, they found a landscape changing almost faster than anyone could believe. Small settlements expanded into busy towns within months. San Francisco offered perhaps the most dramatic example. Only a few years earlier, it had been a modest coastal community. Now ships crowded the harbor. Many crews abandoned their vessels entirely as sailors hurried inland toward the gold fields. Some ships remained anchored for years, slowly weathering beneath the California sun because there were simply not enough people left to sail them home. Farther inland, mining camps appeared beside rivers and streams almost overnight. At first they consisted of only a few tents. Then came wooden cabins, general stores, blacksmith shops, bakeries, hotels, laundry businesses, newspapers, schools, churches. Communities grew wherever enough people gathered. Life inside these camps followed surprisingly ordinary routines. Before sunrise, miners prepared simple breakfasts over campfires. Coffee became almost essential. Alongside it came bread, beans, salt pork, or whatever fresh food happened to be available. After eating, men and women gathered their tools and walked toward nearby rivers. Early mining required little more than determination and simple equipment. Many miners used a shallow metal pan. Scooping gravel from the riverbed, they gently swirled water and sand together, allowing lighter material to wash away while heavier particles settled toward the bottom. The process demanded patience. Hours of careful work might reveal only a few tiny flakes of gold. Occasionally, someone found a larger nugget. Such discoveries spread quickly through camp, encouraging everyone nearby. Yet these moments remained rare. For most miners, success came slowly, if at all. As easily reached deposits disappeared, mining methods gradually became more organized. Groups pooled their resources to dig deeper into hillsides or divert streams using wooden channels. Water-powered equipment helped process larger amounts of gravel. Engineering slowly replaced simple luck. The work itself remained physically demanding. Long hours bent over cold streams left backs aching. Hands became rough from shovels and picks. Summer heat baked the valleys during the afternoon, while mountain mornings often remained surprisingly cool. Still, each new sunrise brought fresh hope. Not everyone searched for gold directly. In fact, some of the most successful people during the gold rush never entered a river with a pan. Merchants quickly realized that miners needed supplies. Stores sold boots, tools, blankets, flour, coffee, candles, and cooking equipment. Blacksmiths repaired broken picks and wagon wheels. Carpenters built homes and businesses. Doctors opened small clinics. Barbers cut hair. Bakers filled the streets with the welcoming smell of fresh bread each morning. Laundry services became especially valuable for miners who spent long days covered in mud and dust. Every growing town required countless skilled workers. The gold rush created opportunities far beyond mining itself. California also attracted immigrants from around the world. Thousands arrived from Mexico, Chile, Peru, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, and China. Each group brought unique languages, traditions, recipes, skills, and customs that added to California's remarkable diversity. Among the largest international communities were Chinese immigrants, many of whom arrived beginning in 1849. Leaving families behind, they crossed the Pacific Ocean, hoping to build better lives through hard work. Some became miners. Others established restaurants, laundries, stores, farms, and businesses that served the growing population. Their contributions became an important part of California's developing economy and culture. Like many immigrant communities throughout history, however, they also faced prejudice, unfair treatment, and discriminatory laws. Despite these challenges, Chinese communities endured, preserving traditions while helping shape the state's future. Evenings offered a welcome change of pace. As daylight faded, campfires flickered across the hillsides. Some miners wrote letters home describing the extraordinary landscapes they had encountered. Others gathered to play music. Fiddles, guitars, and harmonicas filled the cool mountain air. Stories were exchanged about unusually large nuggets, difficult river crossings, or the latest news arriving from San Francisco. After long days of work, these quiet moments of companionship became just as valuable as gold itself. Nature remained the constant backdrop to every activity. Spring wildflowers covered the foothills. Towering pine forests climbed the mountain slopes. Crystal clear rivers rushed down from melting snow high in the Sierra Nevada. Black bears occasionally wandered through the forest searching for food. Deer grazed peacefully in open meadows. The beauty of California often surprised newcomers who had crossed deserts and plains to reach it. By the early 1850s, the easiest gold had largely been collected. Mining became more expensive and increasingly required larger companies with specialized equipment. Many prospectors chose different paths. Some purchased farms, others opened permanent businesses. New towns continued growing long after the excitement of the first discoveries had faded. The gold rush transformed California with astonishing speed. Its population increased dramatically. Roads expanded. Ports grew busier. Trade flourished. Only 2 years after gold was discovered, California entered the Union as the 31st state in 1850. Yet perhaps the gold rush's greatest legacy was not measured in gold alone. It encouraged people from every corner of the world to build new communities across the American West. Bustling frontier towns began appearing wherever opportunity could be found. Stores, schools, churches, hotels, workshops. New neighborhoods filled with families who hoped to turn temporary camps into permanent homes. That is where our journey continues next, as we step beyond the mining camps and explore the everyday life of the frontier towns that became the heart of the growing American West. The town awakened with the sound of footsteps upon wooden sidewalks. Morning sunlight reflected from windows newly washed after an overnight rain. Smoke rose gently from brick chimneys as bakers prepared fresh loaves before dawn. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rang steadily against glowing iron. A wagon rolled slowly down the dusty main street, its wheels leaving familiar tracks between rows of wooden storefronts. Children laughed as they hurried toward a small schoolhouse. Merchants unlocked their doors. The frontier town was beginning another ordinary day. When many people picture towns of the American West, they often imagine dramatic scenes from old Western films. Cowboys facing one another in dusty streets, sheriffs chasing outlaws, constant excitement around every corner. While such events occasionally occurred, they represented only a very small part of everyday life. Most frontier towns were places where ordinary people worked, raised families, opened businesses, attended school, and slowly built communities from the ground up. Some towns began beside military forts. Others appeared near river crossings, railroad stations, mining camps, or busy wagon trails. A few grew almost overnight during the gold rush. Others expanded gradually over many decades. No matter how they began, they all shared one common goal: to create a permanent home. Main Street usually formed the center of town life. Simple wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the road. General stores sold flour, sugar, coffee, fabric, tools, lanterns, nails, and nearly every household item a family might need. Customers often traveled many miles from nearby farms and ranches to purchase supplies. Visiting town became both a practical necessity and an important social occasion. The general store served as much more than a place to shop. It also became an informal gathering place where neighbors exchanged news. Farmers discussed weather and crop conditions. Travelers shared stories from distant settlements. Children admired colorful candy displayed inside glass jars near the counter. The shopkeeper often knew nearly everyone in town by name. Nearby stood the blacksmith's shop, one of the busiest businesses in the community. The familiar rhythm of hammer striking hot iron echoed through the streets from sunrise until evening. Horseshoes wore out, wagon wheels broke, plows required repair before planting season. Every farm, ranch, and business depended upon skilled craftsmen who could keep tools and equipment in working order. Without blacksmiths, frontier towns could not function for long. Hotels and boarding houses welcomed travelers arriving from distant places. Some guests stayed only one night before continuing west. Others remained for weeks while searching for land or waiting for business opportunities. Dining rooms became lively places where strangers shared meals together. Conversations drifted from table to table. A merchant from St. Louis might describe river traffic. A rancher could speak about cattle prices. A school teacher might discuss the opening of a new classroom. The frontier constantly brought new faces into familiar places. Schools quickly became symbols of a growing community. Even small towns often built one-room schoolhouses where children of different ages studied together. A single teacher might instruct 20 or 30 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Lessons included reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history. Older students frequently helped younger ones with difficult lessons. Wood stoves kept classrooms warm during cold winters. Large windows filled the room with natural light. Education represented hope for the future. Parents who had crossed mountains and plains wanted opportunities for their children that reached beyond simple survival. Churches also occupied an important place within town life. Many communities built modest wooden churches that served several purposes throughout the week. Religious services took place on Sundays. During the week, the same building might host weddings, community meetings, holiday celebrations, musical performances, or public lectures. In frontier towns, one building often fulfilled many different needs. Doctors and pharmacists gradually established practices as towns expanded. Medical care remained far simpler than today, yet these professionals became deeply respected members of the community. Doctors traveled on horseback to visit patients living miles beyond town. Pharmacists prepared medicines using the knowledge available at the time. Although treatments were limited by modern standards, their dedication brought comfort during illness and injury. Newspapers connected frontier communities with the wider world. Many towns proudly supported a weekly newspaper printed on large presses powered by hand or steam. Editors reported local births, weddings, harvests, new businesses, church events, and visiting travelers. National news also arrived through newspapers. Readers followed elections, scientific discoveries, railroad construction, and events taking place thousands of miles away. The arrival of each new edition attracted eager readers. Families created comfortable homes wherever they settled. Houses varied greatly. Some were simple log cabins. Others were modest wooden cottages with porches shaded by cottonwood trees. Families planted vegetable gardens. Children helped gather eggs from backyard chickens. Fruit trees slowly matured beside white picket fences. Every season brought familiar routines: spring planting, summer gardening, autumn harvest, winter evenings spent beside warm fireplaces reading aloud or telling stories. Community celebrations became welcome breaks from daily work. Harvest festivals filled the streets with music and shared meals. Parades marked national holidays. School performances drew proud parents into crowded meeting halls. Barn dances brought neighbors together after long weeks of labor. Fiddles played cheerful melodies while couples danced late into the evening. Children chased one another beneath strings of lanterns hung between buildings. These joyful gatherings strengthened friendships that helped communities endure difficult times. The frontier also welcomed newcomers from many different parts of the world. German immigrants established farms and businesses. Irish laborers contributed their skills to construction, railroads, and local industries. Chinese merchants opened stores and restaurants in growing Western communities. Scandinavian families introduced farming traditions from Northern Europe. Mexican families continued long-established traditions throughout the Southwest. Each group added new languages, recipes, music, architecture, and customs that enriched frontier life. Although differences sometimes created misunderstandings, many communities gradually became places where diverse traditions existed side by side. Of course, life still demanded hard work. Women often managed households while also helping with family businesses, tending gardens, sewing clothing, preserving food, and raising children. Men farmed fields, operated shops, practiced trades, or worked in nearby mines and ranches. Children contributed by collecting firewood, carrying water, feeding animals, or assisting with younger brothers and sisters. Every member of the household played an important role. As evening approached, the pace of town slowly changed. Storekeepers swept wooden floors before locking their doors. The final customers stepped out into cooling air. The blacksmith allowed his forge to fade into glowing embers. Church bells occasionally echoed across the rooftops. Lanterns appeared one by one along porches and windows. Families gathered around supper tables, fresh bread, vegetable stew, roasted meat when available, perhaps apple pie baked from fruit harvested nearby. After supper, neighbors often visited one another. Some gathered on front porches to enjoy the cool evening breeze. Others listened as someone read the latest newspaper aloud. Children watched fireflies dancing above the grass, while parents spoke quietly beneath skies filled with brilliant stars. Far from the crowded cities of the East, the night remained wonderfully peaceful. Frontier towns were never simply collections of buildings. They were places where strangers became neighbors, where temporary camps slowly transformed into permanent communities, where schools, churches, businesses, and families laid the foundations for future cities across the American West. As these towns continued growing, another remarkable transformation was quietly taking place across the continent. Steel rails were beginning to stretch farther west each year. The arrival of the railroad would connect distant frontier communities more closely than ever before, changing travel, trade, and daily life in ways few people could yet imagine. That remarkable story is where our journey continues in the next chapter. The sound came first. A distant whistle echoed across the open prairie. Moments later, a thin ribbon of white steam appeared along the horizon. rising steadily into the clear blue sky. The ground began to tremble ever so slightly. Steel wheels rolled across iron rails with a steady rhythm that seemed almost musical. Farmers paused in their fields. Children hurried toward the tracks with excited smiles. Storekeepers stepped outside their businesses. Slowly, the great locomotive emerged into view. Its polished brass reflected the afternoon sunlight. Steam drifted around its massive wheels as it pulled a long line of freight cars and passenger coaches across the American West. For many frontier communities, the arrival of the railroad marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Only a generation earlier, most long-distance travel depended upon horses, wagons, rivers, or stagecoaches. A journey that required months could now be completed in weeks. Goods that once moved slowly across dusty trails could reach distant markets with remarkable speed. The railroad transformed not only transportation but also everyday life throughout the frontier. The dream of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by rail had existed for many years. As settlements expanded farther west, the need for faster communication and transportation became increasingly clear. Merchants hoped to move goods more efficiently. Settlers wanted easier access to distant communities. Government leaders recognized the importance of connecting a rapidly growing nation. Building such a railroad, however, required extraordinary determination. Thousands of miles of track had to cross rivers, deserts, mountains, forests, and endless plains. It became one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century. Construction accelerated during the 1860s. Two major companies worked toward one another from opposite directions. The Central Pacific Railroad began building eastward from Sacramento, California. The Union Pacific Railroad started westward from Omaha, Nebraska. Their goal was simple in theory: meet somewhere in the middle. In practice, the work proved anything but simple. Each morning began long before sunrise. Construction camps slowly awakened as cooks prepared hearty breakfasts over large iron stoves. Workers gathered around rough wooden tables to eat bread, beans, bacon, oatmeal, and hot coffee before another demanding day. Tools were checked, horses harnessed, supply wagons loaded with rails, spikes, timber, and equipment. Soon the camps came alive with activity. Teams of laborers cleared brush and leveled uneven ground. Others dug shallow cuts through hillsides or built raised earth embankments across low valleys. Surveyors carefully measured every curve and elevation. Even small mistakes could create problems for trains traveling at higher speeds. Every mile demanded careful planning. Once the ground had been prepared, crews placed heavy wooden railroad ties at regular intervals. Steel rails rested upon these sturdy foundations. Workers drove long iron spikes into place, using large hammers that rose and fell with steady precision. The rhythmic sound echoed across the landscape, hour after hour. It was exhausting work, yet each completed section represented another small step toward joining an entire continent. The greatest challenges often appeared where nature itself offered resistance. Wide rivers required strong bridges. Mountain ranges demanded tunnels carved through solid rock. Winter storms buried work sites beneath deep snow. Summer heat baked the plains until dust covered every tool and every piece of clothing. Still, construction continued, patiently, steadily, day after day. Among the thousands of workers who built the western portion of the railroad were many Chinese immigrants. Beginning in the 1860s, the Central Pacific Railroad hired large numbers of Chinese laborers, whose skill, discipline, and determination soon became widely recognized. They blasted tunnels through the granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains. They carried supplies across steep slopes. They worked through heavy snowfall during harsh winters. The conditions were often extremely difficult, yet their contributions became essential to completing the railroad. Many had left families behind in China, hoping that years of hard work might create better opportunities for those they loved. On the eastern section of the line, Irish immigrants formed a significant part of the Union Pacific workforce. Many had previously worked on canals, roads, or railroads in the eastern United States before continuing west. Alongside them worked Civil War veterans, formerly enslaved African Americans seeking new opportunities, recent immigrants from many European countries, Mexican laborers, and American-born workers from farming communities across the nation. The railroad became one of the most diverse workplaces of its era. Although people spoke different languages and came from different backgrounds, they shared the common task of building something far larger than any one individual. Construction camps developed their own daily rhythm. Blacksmiths repaired worn tools from dawn until dusk. Carpenters built temporary bridges and housing. Doctors treated injuries and common illnesses. Laundry workers washed clothing covered with dust and mud. Merchants opened small stores selling food, boots, blankets, and everyday supplies. Even in temporary camps, ordinary community life quietly took shape. As new stretches of track opened, trains began arriving in towns that had once seemed wonderfully isolated. The changes appeared almost immediately. Fresh produce reached markets more quickly. Letters arrived in days rather than weeks. Newspapers carried recent news from distant cities. Farmers gained larger markets for wheat, cattle, and other products. General stores expanded their selections because supplies could now arrive regularly by rail. The railroad also worked closely alongside another remarkable invention, the telegraph. Wooden poles carrying thin wires often followed the tracks across the continent. Messages that once traveled no faster than a galloping horse could now cross thousands of miles in only minutes. Station agents tapped brief messages using Morse code, connecting frontier towns with major cities in ways earlier generations could scarcely imagine. For travelers, the railroad transformed the experience of crossing the American West. Instead of spending months walking beside covered wagons, passengers could relax inside comfortable rail cars. Large windows framed changing landscapes, the rolling prairies, the towering Rocky Mountains, broad rivers reflecting the afternoon sun. Passengers read books, played cards, shared conversations, or simply watched the scenery unfold mile after mile. Dining cars served warm meals. Sleeping cars offered beds for overnight journeys. Travel became not only faster, but far more comfortable. Of course, the arrival of the railroad also brought significant change to the landscapes and communities it crossed. New towns appeared beside stations. Older wagon routes gradually became less important. Trade patterns shifted. The movement of people increased dramatically. Native nations, whose homelands were crossed by expanding rail lines, experienced profound changes as settlement accelerated across the West. The railroad became part of a much larger transformation that reshaped the frontier during the second half of the 19th century. One unforgettable day finally arrived on May 10, 1869. At Promontory Summit in present-day Utah, workers completed the final connection between the Central Pacific and Union Pacific railroads. A ceremonial golden spike marked the joining of the nation's first transcontinental railroad. Celebrations followed. Telegraph operators immediately shared the news across the country. For many Americans, it symbolized the growing connection between East and West. Yet even as railroads stretched across the plains, another familiar figure continued traveling routes where steel tracks had not yet reached. Mounted beneath wide-brimmed hats, guiding great herds of cattle across open grasslands, the American cowboy became one of the enduring symbols of frontier life. That quiet story is where our journey continues in the next chapter, as we explore the everyday routines, long cattle drives, and remarkable skills of the cowboys who spent countless days beneath the endless skies of the Great Plains. Long before sunrise, the prairie rested beneath a sky filled with stars. The cool night air carried the sweet scent of wild grass stretching endlessly toward every horizon. Only the quiet rustling of cattle disturbed the silence. Thousands of longhorns stood together in the darkness, their broad horns silhouetted against the fading moonlight. Nearby, a small campfire glowed softly. Several cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, warming tin cups of coffee before another long day on the trail. One rider quietly mounted his horse. His task was the night watch. Throughout the darkness, cowboys took turns riding slowly around the sleeping herd, humming gentle songs to keep the cattle calm. A sudden loud noise or unexpected movement could startle the animals into a dangerous stampede. Soft voices and familiar melodies helped settle the restless herd. It was patient work, peaceful work, and one of the most important responsibilities of every cattle drive. The American cowboy has become one of the most recognizable figures in frontier history. Wide-brimmed hat, leather boots, a coiled rope resting beside the saddle. Yet the real daily life of a cowboy was often far quieter than the dramatic stories told in novels and films. Most days were filled not with adventure, but with steady routines, careful teamwork, and long hours spent caring for cattle beneath enormous western skies. Following the Civil War, the cattle industry expanded rapidly across Texas and the Great Plains. Millions of longhorn cattle grazed freely across open ranges. At the same time, growing cities farther north created an increasing demand for beef. The challenge was transportation. Before railroads reached every ranch, cattle had to be driven hundreds of miles to railheads in Kansas where they could continue east by train. Thus began the great cattle drives. Each spring, ranches prepared for the journey. Cowboys gathered herds that often numbered between 2,000 and 3,000 cattle. The trail boss carefully selected an experienced crew. A typical drive might include 10 or 12 cowboys, a cook, and occasionally a horse wrangler responsible for managing the extra horses. Together, they would spend months traveling across open country. The day began remarkably early. Well before dawn, the cook was already awake. His wagon, known as the chuck wagon, served as the kitchen and supply center for the entire crew. Inside were sacks of flour, beans, coffee, bacon, dried fruit, salt, sugar, cooking pots, cast iron skillets, Dutch ovens, nearly everything needed to feed hard-working men far from towns and settlements. The chuck wagon became the heart of camp life. Breakfast was simple but satisfying. Fresh biscuits baked in cast iron ovens, bacon sizzling over an open fire, beans slowly warming in heavy pots, strong black coffee poured into well-used tin cups. After eating, bedrolls were packed, horses saddled, and the cattle gradually encouraged onto the trail once again. Every cowboy developed a close relationship with his horse. A reliable horse was more than transportation. It was a trusted companion. Together, they crossed rivers, climbed hills, and spent countless hours moving quietly beside the herd. Most cowboys rode several different horses during a long drive, allowing each animal time to rest. Good horses were valued with great care. The cattle themselves determined the pace. Rather than pushing the herd too quickly, cowboys encouraged a slow, steady walk that preserved the animal's strength. A typical drive covered only 10 or 15 miles in a day. Patience remained far more important than speed. Young calves wandered beside their mothers. Older steers grazed whenever the opportunity arose. The trail unfolded gradually beneath countless hooves. Each cowboy held a particular position around the herd. Trail bosses directed the overall journey. Point riders guided the cattle at the front. Swing riders remained along the sides. Flank riders watched the middle. Drag riders followed behind, often enduring long hours surrounded by clouds of dust stirred up by thousands of moving animals. Every position mattered. Success depended upon teamwork rather than individual heroics. Nature shaped nearly every decision. Clear streams offered welcome places for both cattle and horses to drink. Cottonwood trees provided precious afternoon shade. Thunderstorms sometimes appeared suddenly across the plains, sending rolling thunder echoing toward the horizon. Heavy rain transformed dusty trails into muddy ground. Lightning flashed across dark skies before drifting away once more. The cowboys learned to respect the weather rather than resist it. River crossings demanded particular care. A calm stream could usually be crossed without difficulty, but swollen rivers after heavy rain required patience. The herd entered the water slowly. Cowboys positioned themselves carefully around the cattle, encouraging them across while preventing confusion. Strong swimming horses proved invaluable. When everyone reached the opposite bank safely, there was always a quiet sense of accomplishment. Wildlife remained a constant companion. Prairie dogs barked from their burrows. Pronghorn antelope raced effortlessly across the grasslands. Coyotes watched from distant hills. Hawks circled high above, searching for movement below. Occasionally, buffalo still appeared on parts of the open range, reminding travelers that these plains had supported enormous herds for countless generations. As evening approached, the cattle gradually settled into grazing areas selected for the night. The chuck wagon arrived. Horses were unsaddled and brushed. A fresh fire crackled beneath the growing darkness. Supper often included beef stew, beans, biscuits, potatoes, or dried fruit for dessert if supplies allowed. After long hours in the saddle, even the simplest meal tasted wonderful. Camp became the social center of the day. Cowboys shared stories gathered from different ranches and trails. Someone might quietly play a harmonica. Another sang old folk songs remembered from childhood. Letters from home were read whenever the mail reached the trail. Laughter drifted gently into the cool evening air. Many cowboys came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. Some had grown up on farms across the Midwest. Others had been soldiers during the Civil War. Many were Mexican vaqueros whose cattle handling traditions greatly influenced cowboy culture. African American cowboys also played a significant role in the cattle industry, with historians estimating that roughly 1 in 4 cowboys during this era was black. Native American cowboys likewise worked on ranches throughout the West. Although their backgrounds differed, life on the trail often depended far more upon skill, reliability, and mutual trust than upon where someone had been born. The traditions of the cowboy reflected many cultures working together across the frontier. As the years passed, however, the era of the great cattle drive slowly began to fade. Railroads expanded farther south into Texas. More ranches gained direct access to shipping points. Barbed wire divided much of the once open range into fenced pastures. Long drives across hundreds of miles became less common. The frontier itself was changing once again. Still, the image of the cowboy endured. Not because of dramatic gunfights or exciting legends, but because it represented perseverance, quiet responsibility, long days beneath open skies, and the enduring partnership between people, animals, and the vast landscapes of the American West. Even as ranching continued, thousands of new families were arriving to claim land across the plains. Instead of driving cattle, they carried plows, seeds, and hopes for permanent homes. Their story would become the next great chapter in the history of the frontier. In our next journey, we'll meet the homesteaders who built sod houses upon the prairie, planted fields beneath endless skies, and slowly transformed open grasslands into thriving farming communities. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the warm light of an early autumn morning. Golden grasses swayed gently in the breeze like waves upon a quiet sea. The sky seemed almost impossibly large. Only a few scattered cottonwood trees stood beside a winding creek that reflected the pale blue of the heavens above. In every direction the land appeared open, untouched, patiently waiting through another changing season. Across this vast landscape, a single wagon rolled slowly forward. Its wheels creaked softly over the uneven ground. Behind it walked a family, pausing every so often to study the surrounding prairie. There were no streets, no neighboring houses, no church steeples rising above the horizon. Only grass, sky, and possibility. For thousands of families during the second half of the 19th century, this was the beginning of a new home. The Homestead Act, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, encouraged settlers to establish farms across portions of the American frontier. Under certain conditions, families could claim parcels of public land if they agreed to live on it, improve it, and cultivate the soil. For many people living in crowded towns or working as tenant farmers, the opportunity represented something extraordinary, a chance to own land of their very own. News of available homesteads spread quickly. Families from the eastern United States packed their belongings. Immigrants arriving from Germany, Sweden, Norway, Bohemia, Ireland, and many other parts of Europe also joined the movement westward. Each carried hopes for a more secure future. The journey often ended not in bustling towns but in quiet stretches of open prairie where almost everything still had to be built. The first challenge was finding shelter. Trees were scarce across much of the Great Plains. Without abundant timber, building a traditional log cabin was often impossible. So many homesteaders turned to the very ground beneath their feet. They built sod houses. Using heavy plows, settlers cut thick strips of prairie grass and soil into sturdy blocks. These pieces of sod were carefully stacked like bricks, forming walls sometimes 2 feet thick. Wood supported the roof whenever it could be obtained, while additional layers of sod helped insulate the structure. From a distance, the houses almost seemed to grow naturally from the prairie itself. Inside, they were surprisingly comfortable. The thick walls kept interiors cool during hot summers and warm throughout cold winters. Furniture remained simple: a wooden table, several handmade chairs, iron bedsteads, shelves built from rough lumber. A cast iron stove became the heart of the home, providing warmth for cooking, baking, and heating through the long winter months. Life settled into a familiar rhythm. Before sunrise, smoke curled from stovepipes as breakfast was prepared. Fresh biscuits, cornmeal porridge, eggs when chickens were available, coffee for the adults, warm milk for the children. The family gathered around the table before stepping outside to begin another busy day. Every season brought different responsibilities. Spring was a time of planting. Fields were carefully plowed using horses or sturdy oxen. Seeds of wheat, corn, oats, or barley were sown into freshly turned earth. Everyone helped. Children carried water. Parents guided plows across the fields. Even the youngest family members gathered stones or helped tend small gardens near the house. Summer demanded long hours. Crops required constant attention. Vegetable gardens flourished beside the home. Beans climbed wooden poles. Pumpkins spread across the ground. Tomatoes ripened beneath the warm prairie sun. Wildflowers bloomed along fences while bees drifted quietly from blossom to blossom. The prairie itself remained wonderfully alive. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts. Jackrabbits darted through tall grass. Pronghorn antelope occasionally appeared in the distance before disappearing once again beyond the rolling hills. Autumn became the busiest season of all. Harvest time arrived. Golden wheat swayed across the fields. Families worked together from sunrise until sunset, gathering crops before colder weather arrived. Neighbors often helped one another. One family's harvest today, another family's tomorrow. Shared labor strengthened friendships that became essential in places where the nearest neighbor might live several miles away. Winter transformed the prairie completely. Snow covered the open grasslands. Powerful winds swept across the plains, sculpting drifts against fences and barns. Inside the sod house, however, life continued quietly. Wood crackled inside the stove. Stews simmered slowly in iron pots. Children completed school lessons by lamplight, while parents repaired tools, mended clothing, or planned next year's planting. Books became treasured companions during the long evenings. So did storytelling. Grandparents shared memories of earlier journeys west. Parents spoke about hopes for the future. Children listened as the winter wind whispered outside. Water remained one of the greatest daily concerns. Some homesteaders settled near rivers or creeks. Others dug wells, a task requiring patience and determination. Every bucket of fresh water mattered. It was used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, laundry, caring for animals. Nothing went to waste. Life upon the prairie encouraged careful stewardship of every resource. School remained an important priority. As communities grew, neighbors worked together to construct simple one-room schoolhouses. Children often walked several miles each morning to attend class. One teacher instructed students of many different ages. Lessons covered reading, writing, mathematics, geography, and history. Education represented an investment in the future, offering opportunities beyond the hardships of frontier life. Churches and community halls soon followed. These modest buildings welcomed religious services, weddings, harvest celebrations, musical performances, and town meetings. They became places where friendships deepened and new arrivals received warm welcomes. On Saturdays, families often gathered to exchange news, trade supplies, or simply enjoy one another's company after long weeks of work. Music brought joy to many gatherings. Someone played a fiddle, another accompanied with a harmonica. Children danced across wooden floors, while neighbors shared homemade pies, fresh bread, and preserves carefully prepared from summer fruit. These moments reminded everyone that community could flourish even in the most distant places. Of course, life also brought challenges. Drought sometimes reduced harvests. Grasshopper swarms occasionally swept across the plains, consuming crops with astonishing speed. Blizzards arrived with little warning during winter, yet homesteaders learned to adapt. They stored food for difficult seasons, built stronger barns, shared supplies with neighbors when times became hard. The frontier rewarded cooperation far more often than isolation. The prairie slowly changed. Windmills appeared beside farmhouses, drawing fresh water from deep underground. Fences divided open fields. Orchards began producing apples and cherries. New barns rose against the horizon, painted bright red beneath wide western skies. What had once been open grassland gradually became a patchwork of farms, villages, and growing towns. The work of thousands of ordinary families transformed the landscape one field at a time. Yet by the closing decades of the 19th century, many people began noticing that the frontier itself was changing. Railroads connected distant settlements. Large cities continued expanding. Open spaces became increasingly settled. The era of constant westward movement that had shaped so much of American history was slowly drawing toward its conclusion. In our next and final historical chapter, we'll reflect upon the closing of the American frontier and consider how a landscape once filled with unexplored horizons became a nation connected by towns, farms, railroads, and communities stretching from coast to coast. The evening sun settled gently beyond the western horizon. Its golden light stretched across quiet fields, where rows of wheat swayed softly in the cooling breeze. A train rolled steadily through the distance, its whistle echoing across the countryside before fading into silence. Nearby, children chased one another along a wooden fence while their parents finished the final chores of the day. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys. Church bells rang in a nearby town. The American frontier had become a very different place from the one that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark first entered nearly a century earlier. The endless unknown was slowly giving way to familiar communities. Roads connected growing towns. Railroads crossed mountains and plains. Telegraph wires carried messages from coast to coast. Schools, churches, businesses, and farms now stood where open grasslands had once stretched toward every horizon. By the closing decades of the 19th century, many Americans began asking an unexpected question. Had the frontier itself come to an end? For generations, the frontier had never been a single line upon a map. Instead, it had been a constantly changing place where settled communities gradually met less populated regions. As families moved westward, the frontier moved with them. It was always shifting, always changing, always inviting another journey beyond the next horizon. But each passing decade brought new settlements. The Homestead Act encouraged thousands of farms. Railroads made distant travel faster than ever before. Mining towns became permanent cities. New states joined the Union. The spaces between communities steadily grew smaller. One of the simplest inventions also transformed the landscape: barbed wire. Patented during the 1870s, inexpensive fencing allowed farmers and ranchers to mark property boundaries across the Great Plains without requiring large amounts of timber. Long stretches of open range gradually became enclosed pastures. Cattle no longer wandered freely across unlimited grasslands. Farmers protected crops from wandering livestock. Land ownership became more clearly defined. The appearance of the prairie slowly changed. Roads also improved. What had once been little more than wagon tracks became well-traveled routes linking neighboring towns. Bridges crossed rivers that had once delayed travelers for days. Stagecoaches continued operating in many regions, while railroads carried passengers and freight across much greater distances with remarkable speed. Travel that once required months could now often be completed in only a few days. Communication changed just as dramatically. Telegraph offices connected communities across thousands of miles. Newspapers arrived regularly, bringing national and international news to towns that had once depended entirely upon passing travelers for information. Later, the telephone slowly began appearing in some communities, offering yet another new way for neighbors and businesses to remain connected. Even the pace of daily life began to feel different. Cities expanded rapidly throughout the West. Denver, Omaha, Kansas City, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Each continued growing as new residents arrived seeking opportunity. Brick buildings replaced many earlier wooden structures. Electric streetlights gradually appeared in larger communities. Horse-drawn streetcars carried passengers through busy downtown districts. The frontier was becoming increasingly urban. Agriculture also entered a new era. Farmers adopted improved machinery that allowed larger fields to be cultivated with fewer workers. Mechanical reapers harvested grain more efficiently than hand tools alone. Steel plows cut through prairie soil with greater ease. Windmills pumped water from deep wells. New techniques gradually improved harvests while reducing some of the physical labor required. The landscape reflected these quiet innovations. Across the West, schoolhouses multiplied. Children who might once have spent entire seasons helping on isolated homesteads now attended regular classes in growing communities. Libraries opened, colleges expanded, teachers encouraged students to imagine futures that extended beyond the farms where many had grown up. Education became one of the lasting foundations of these developing states. Communities also continued growing more diverse. Immigrant families from Europe, Asia, Mexico, and many other parts of the world contributed their traditions, languages, foods, music, and skills to frontier towns that were rapidly becoming permanent cities. Native nations likewise continued preserving their cultures, languages, and traditions despite profound changes brought by westward expansion and government policies. The history of the American frontier belonged to many different peoples whose experiences often differed greatly from one another. As historians looked back upon the 19th century, they increasingly recognized that the frontier had been a place of opportunity for some, while also bringing significant hardship, displacement, and change for others. Its story could not be understood from only a single perspective. It was far more complex than simple legends often suggested. Perhaps no event symbolized the changing frontier more clearly than the United States Census of 1890. Every 10 years, census workers counted the nation's growing population. When officials reviewed the results in 1890, they reached an important conclusion. So many communities now stretched across the continent that it had become difficult to identify a clear frontier line separating settled and unsettled regions. The Census Bureau announced that the traditional frontier could no longer be clearly defined. For many Americans, this announcement carried great symbolic meaning. An era that had lasted for generations appeared to be drawing to a close. The news inspired reflection rather than celebration. People remembered the explorers who had crossed unknown rivers, the mountain men who learned hidden valleys, the wagon trains that had followed dusty trails toward Oregon and California, the merchants of the Santa Fe Trail, the soldiers stationed at lonely frontier forts, the ranchers, cowboys, railroad workers, miners, homesteaders, teachers, shopkeepers, doctors, and countless families who had built ordinary lives across extraordinary landscapes. Most had never imagined themselves becoming historical figures. They simply worked, raised children, helped neighbors, and adapted to changing circumstances. Yet together, they transformed an entire continent. Their greatest achievements were often surprisingly ordinary. A harvested field, a repaired bridge, a new school, a thriving business, a successful harvest after years of patient effort. History is often remembered through dramatic moments, but lasting change usually arrives through thousands of quiet days much like these. Even after 1890, of course, the American West continued evolving. Cities expanded. National parks protected remarkable landscapes. Industries developed. New generations built upon the foundations laid by those who came before. The frontier did not truly disappear. Instead, it became part of the nation's shared memory. Its stories continued inspiring artists, writers, photographers, historians, and travelers who wished to understand how the United States had grown from a young republic into a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the frontier leaves behind. Not that every mystery was solved, nor that every challenge disappeared, but that each generation inherited landscapes shaped by those who had walked them before, while leaving new paths for those who would someday follow. Now, as the sun slips below the horizon and the western sky fades from gold to deep shades of blue, our long journey across the American frontier is almost complete. One final chapter remains, a quiet reflection upon everything we have seen together. The rivers, The mountains, the endless prairies, the forests, the towns, and the countless ordinary people whose patient lives became the true story of the American frontier. The night had settled gently across the American West. The last colors of sunset had faded beyond distant mountains, leaving the sky filled with countless stars. A cool breeze moved softly through the prairie grass. Somewhere nearby, a creek whispered over smooth stones exactly as it had for thousands of years. The land itself seemed wonderfully quiet. If you stood here long enough, you might almost imagine hearing echoes from every chapter of our journey. The splash of Lewis and Clark's boats upon the Missouri River, the distant laughter of mountain men gathered at a summer rendezvous, the steady creak of wagon wheels crossing the Oregon Trail, the whistle of a locomotive rolling across the plains, the gentle songs of cowboys riding night watch beneath the stars. All of those sounds belonged to different moments in history, yet together they formed the story of the American frontier. Over the past century, the West had changed in remarkable ways. Small trading posts became thriving towns. Temporary mining camps grew into permanent cities. Lonely prairie homesteads developed into prosperous farming communities. Railroads linked distant regions once separated by months of travel. Schools welcomed new generations of students. Churches gathered neighbors together. Businesses opened their doors each morning. Families planted roots that would continue for generations. Yet despite all these changes, the land itself remained astonishingly beautiful. The Rocky Mountains still rose above the clouds. The Missouri River continued its long journey toward the Mississippi. Buffalo grass still bent with the prairie winds. Ancient forests still covered mountain slopes where sunlight filtered through towering pines. The landscapes that had inspired explorers, native nations, settlers, ranchers, and travelers continued to shape the lives of those who called the West home. Today, many of those remarkable places remain protected. Visitors can walk sections of the Oregon Trail where wagon ruts are still visible after more than a century. Historic frontier forts welcome guests eager to learn about everyday military life. Restored mining towns preserve wooden buildings where hopeful prospectors once gathered. National parks protect vast mountain valleys, deserts, forests, and grasslands that look much as they did when the first explorers carefully described them in their journals. Standing in these places today offers a quiet reminder that history is not only found inside books. Sometimes it lives beneath our feet. Many native nations continue to thrive throughout the American West. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Comanche, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Pawnee, the Arapaho, and many others whose ancestors shaped these landscapes long before the arrival of European explorers. Today, native communities continue preserving languages, ceremonies, traditional arts, music, and stories passed carefully from one generation to the next. Cultural centers, museums, schools, and tribal colleges help ensure that these traditions remain vibrant for future generations. The history of the frontier did not begin with westward expansion, nor did it end when the 19th century closed. It continues through the lives of the people who still call these lands home today. The descendants of homesteaders also remain across the plains. Some families continue farming fields first settled by grandparents or great-grandparents more than 100 years ago. Modern equipment has replaced horse-drawn plows. Electric lights illuminate barns that once depended upon lanterns. Weather forecasts now arrive instantly rather than by telegraph or newspaper. Yet many daily routines remain surprisingly familiar. Planting each spring, harvesting each autumn, watching the weather with hopeful eyes, caring for livestock, gathering around family tables at the end of long working days. The rhythm of the land still shapes life across much of the West. Railroads continue carrying freight across mountain passes. first crossed by surveyors and laborers during the 19th century. Interstate highways now follow many of the same natural routes once used by wagon trains. Airplanes cross the continent in only a few hours, soaring high above rivers, deserts, and forests that once required months to traverse on foot. Technology has changed dramatically. Distance has grown smaller. Yet the geography remains wonderfully familiar. Many Western towns still preserve their historic main streets. Brick storefronts built during the late 19th century now house bookstores, cafes, museums, and family businesses. Old railroad depots stand carefully restored. Historic hotels continue welcoming travelers just as they did generations ago. Walking through these communities can feel like stepping quietly into another era where echoes of frontier life remain tucked between modern buildings and busy sidewalks. The frontier has also continued to inspire artists and storytellers. Painters captured endless skies glowing above prairie grass. Photographers recorded mountain landscapes bathed in early morning light. Novelists imagined journeys across dusty trails. Musicians wrote songs celebrating rivers, railroads, ranches, and open country. Filmmakers introduced audiences around the world to dramatic versions of Western history. Some stories emphasized adventure. Others explored hardship, resilience, or the search for belonging. Together, they help keep the frontier alive within the imagination of future generations. Historians, too, continue discovering new perspectives. Earlier histories often focused primarily upon explorers, military leaders, or famous pioneers. Today, researchers also study the experiences of women, children, immigrant communities, native nations, African American settlers, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad workers, school teachers, merchants, farmers, and countless others whose voices once received less attention. The story of the frontier has grown richer with every generation of scholarship. It reminds us that history is rarely told by only a handful of remarkable individuals. Instead, it is woven together from millions of ordinary lives. Perhaps that is the greatest gift the frontier leaves behind. Not simply stories of exploration or settlement or invention, but a deeper appreciation for the quiet perseverance found in everyday life. A family planting its first garden, a blacksmith repairing a broken wagon wheel, a teacher opening the doors of a one-room schoolhouse, a child watching a train arrive for the very first time, a cowboy singing softly beneath the stars, a native elder passing ancient stories to curious grandchildren. These moments may seem small, yet together they shape the American West far more completely than any single dramatic event ever could. As we look back across the long path we have traveled together, the frontier begins to feel less like a place upon a map and more like a long conversation between people and the land itself. Each generation learned from rivers, adapted to changing seasons, built homes where none had stood before, and left behind quiet traces for those who would someday follow. Now, our journey is nearly complete. One final stop remains, a peaceful moment to reflect upon everything we have seen together, allowing the rivers, mountains, forests, and endless prairies of the American frontier to slowly fade into the calm stillness of memory as the stars continue their quiet journey across the western sky. The night is wonderfully still. Above you, the stars shine with quiet certainty, scattered across the great western sky, just as they have for countless generations. A gentle breeze moves through the tall prairie grass. Somewhere in the distance, a river continues its patient journey toward the sea. The world feels calm, unhurried, peaceful, and as our journey draws to its close, it is time to look back one final time. When we first began this evening, we stood beside the broad Mississippi River in the spring of 1803. The United States was still a young nation. Beyond the river stretched an immense landscape that seemed almost impossible to imagine. Maps showed enormous blank spaces. Rumors traveled farther than certainty. For many Americans living along the Atlantic coast, the West existed only in stories. Yet those lands were never truly unknown. For thousands of years, native nations had lived among these rivers, forests, mountains, deserts, and grasslands. They knew every changing season, every dependable spring, every migration of buffalo, every winding trail through distant valleys. Their histories reached back centuries before the arrival of European explorers. That understanding became the foundation upon which so much of frontier history would unfold. We followed Meriwether Lewis and William Clark as they pushed their boats slowly against the current of the Missouri River. Each bend revealed another unfamiliar landscape. Each page of their journals filled another empty place upon the map. Their expedition became one of discovery not only for the young United States, but also for science itself. Plants, animals, rivers, mountains, cultures. The continent gradually became better understood, one careful observation at a time. From there, we climbed into the Rocky Mountains alongside the mountain men. We listened to rushing streams hidden beneath towering pine forests. We watched beavers quietly building their dams. We joined the summer rendezvous where traders, trappers, and native communities gathered beneath magnificent mountain peaks. The wilderness rewarded patience. Knowledge mattered more than speed. Every trail had first been learned by someone willing to observe the land carefully. Then we stepped onto the endless Great Plains. The prairie rolled toward distant horizons beneath skies so wide they seemed to embrace the entire earth. Immense buffalo herds moved across the grasslands. Horsemen rode with remarkable grace. Families lived within welcoming camps where stories, traditions, and skills passed gently from one generation to the next. The plains were not empty spaces waiting to be filled. They were living homelands rich with culture, history, and community. Our journey next carried us inside the quiet rhythm of frontier forts. Morning bugles echoed across parade grounds. Blacksmiths shaped glowing iron beside busy workshops. Children attended school while soldiers repaired wagons, cared for horses, and waited eagerly for letters arriving from distant homes. Even in isolated places, ordinary life remained wonderfully familiar. Families shared meals, neighbors gathered together, communities slowly grew. Then came the great roads west. We traveled the Santa Fe Trail where merchants carried goods between Missouri and the Southwest. We followed the Oregon Trail beside hopeful families, willing to walk thousands of miles in search of new beginnings. We crossed rivers, camped beneath countless stars, watched children laugh beside evening campfires after long days upon the trail. Their journeys demanded courage, but perhaps even more than courage. They demanded patience. Next came California. Quiet rivers suddenly glittered with unexpected promise. Gold drew people from every corner of the world. Mining camps became towns. Towns became cities. Merchants, carpenters, bakers, teachers, doctors, laundresses, and blacksmiths all helped build communities that would long outlast the excitement of the first discoveries. The true wealth of the gold rush was not measured only in precious metal. It also appeared in neighborhoods, businesses, friendships, and new beginnings. We wandered the wooden sidewalks of frontier towns where church bells rang each Sunday morning. Children recited lessons inside one-room schoolhouses. Neighbors gathered upon shaded porches during cool summer evenings. General stores became gathering places where stories traveled almost as quickly as supplies. The frontier slowly became home. Then the sound of the railroad echoed across the plains. Steel rails connected oceans. telegraph wires carried messages farther and faster than ever before. Thousands of workers from many different backgrounds labored together to complete one of history's greatest engineering achievements. Distance itself seemed to shrink. Travel changed forever. Out upon the open range, we rode quietly beside the cowboys. Longhorn cattle grazed beneath enormous skies. Night riders hummed gentle songs beneath the stars to keep restless herds calm. The work demanded responsibility rather than excitement, care, skill, steady hands, and quiet endurance. Later, we visited the Homesteaders. Families built homes from prairie sod, planted orchards where none had stood before, watched children grow alongside fields of wheat that rippled beneath the western wind. Season followed season, spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter reflection. The rhythm of the land shaped every part of life. Finally, we watched as the frontier itself slowly changed. Railroads reached farther west, cities expanded, schools multiplied, communities flourished. The great frontier that had once seemed endless gradually became connected by farms, roads, towns, and neighborhoods, stretching from one horizon to another. And yet, perhaps the frontier never truly disappeared, not entirely, because the frontier was never only a place, it was also a spirit of curiosity, a willingness to learn, to adapt, to explore unfamiliar paths, to build communities with patience and hope. Those qualities remain timeless. If we pause for a quiet moment now, the landscape around us begins to feel wonderfully alive once again. The Missouri River still flows beneath morning mist. The Rocky Mountains still greet the sunrise with snow-covered peaks. Prairie grasses continue bending beneath gentle winds. Coyotes still call across open valleys after sunset. Cottonwood leaves still shimmer beside winding creeks. The stars above remain unchanged. Generations have looked upward toward those same constellations. Native hunters, explorers, mountain men, merchants, settlers, railroad workers, cowboys, homesteaders, children lying beside evening campfires, parents standing quietly upon farmhouse porches after another long day's work. Each looked toward the same sky. Each wondered what tomorrow might bring. History often feels distant, separated from us by photographs faded with age or pages preserved inside old books. But perhaps history is much quieter than that. Perhaps it lives wherever someone plants a seed with hope for spring, where neighbors lend one another a helping hand, where stories are shared around dinner tables, where families gather beneath evening skies. The frontier was built not only by famous names remembered in textbooks, it was built by ordinary people living ordinary days, millions of quiet moments woven together across an extraordinary landscape. And now, our own journey has reached its gentle ending. The campfires have grown dim. The wagon wheels have fallen silent. The trains have disappeared beyond the horizon. The cattle have settled peacefully for the night. The prairie rests beneath a blanket of stars. The rivers continue flowing quietly through forests and valleys. The mountains stand patiently beneath moonlight, just as they always have. As sleep slowly begins to arrive, you may leave this place, knowing that those rivers still flow, those forests still whisper in the wind, those mountains still greet each sunrise, and somewhere, carried gently upon the evening breeze, the quiet story of the American frontier continues. Thank you for joining me on this long journey across the American West. Until next time, good night.